Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation which covers the content of Egyptian mummification. This is in particular, pretty in-depth view and overview, if you will, of the way that the Egyptians successfully mummified a deceased corpse. In particular, we're going to be looking at how they actually mummified pharaohs and, of course, nobles in Egyptian society. Furthermore, please, before I begin, let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson on the Google Doc and to fill in any key content or answer any key concept questions that appeared throughout the Google Doc. Remember, you can replay any part of this presentation that you need for clarity and help later. Let's go ahead and get started. Egyptian mummification. What happens after we die? The ever-popular question with some relatively ill-defined answers. Many people believe in religion, and they have faith and strong abidance by spirits and special deities that guide them and give them comfort and knowing. But no matter what your opinion is, the physical process of how we prepare a dead body or a deceased body is quite interesting. Section 1. The process. The purpose of Egyptian mummification. The ancient Egyptians believed that after death, their bodies would travel to another world during the day, and then at night they would return to their bodies. That might be why they place such great care and emphasis in making sure that as much as possible, the original contours and characteristics of a pharaoh's body were in fact intact so that they could recognize their own body when, of course, coming back from their journey through the afterlife. In order for the person's spirit to live forever, it had to be able to recognize and return to the body, as stated before. But if a spirit could not recognize the body it belonged to, it would die. This is why the Egyptians not only wanted to preserve the bodies of the dead in as lifelike a state as possible, but mummification guaranteed eternal life for the spirit. In fact, if you're familiar with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they lay down pretty much a clear and vivid explanation for just how one can travel to the afterlife safely. The mummification process. Did you know that the entire process took 70 days to complete? Several embalmers, in fact, conducted the task in special embalming shops or Parnefer. The chief embalmer was known as the Eri Shasta, and he wore a jackal mask to represent Anubis, the god of mummification. As seen here, you might have seen several different types of Egyptian artwork that depict this type of scene, as stated. After the body had been shaved and washed with wine and spices, all the parts that might decay were in fact removed. The embalmers first removed the brain through the nose using a long hook. Now, some of you might be familiar with some parts of mummification before from prior knowledge and or prior classes, but yes, it is in fact true that they use this hook to insert through the nostrils to essentially get the brain out of the human anatomy. So the long hook was used to stir up the brain until it was actually liquefied. Then the embalmers would turn the body face down to allow the brain to ooze out of the nostrils. The Egyptians were so rough on the brain because they didn't realize its importance that they thought that its sole purpose was to produce snot. So as you can see here, although they had a great understanding of the rest of the human anatomy, relatively speaking, their understanding of the brain was somewhat, of course, lacking. Section 2. The rationale and mythology behind the process of mummification. Next, they would remove the soft, moist body parts that would cause decay, and a deep incision was made in the left side of the abdomen to remove all internal organ. The lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines were the foremost vital organs that they wanted to take out of the body. When they did so, they were able to actually store these organs inside of canopic jars. In some cases, they removed the heart, but in others they left it, because it was considered to be the seat of the soul that testified on behalf of the deceased during judgment before the gods. This picture right here is pretty much the iconic scene of where the heart is weighed after a person's time on earth is over, and judging based on the actions of life, they would of course be able to assume a peaceful afterlife and transition. The body was then stuffed with bundles of strong drying salt called natron. As depicted here, you can imagine that this was definitely a process. The natron allowed the chance for the human anatomy to maintain somewhat of a human-like form. As you're aware, after you might be deceased, your anatomy essentially caves into itself. It was then completely covered with natron and placed on slanted couches so that many fluids that dripped out as the body was drying could be collected and buried along with it. While the body was drying, the internal organs were also dried and preserved with natron. They were then wrapped in strips of linen and put into separate containers called canopic jars, as alluded to before. And the Egyptians believed that all body parts would be magically reunited in the afterlife, and the body would become whole again, just like the story behind the god Osiris. As you may or may not be aware, the linen wrappings were in fact really strong. In fact, many Egyptologists especially believe that that's why some of these mummies that were discovered in years later were so well preserved in this way. According to Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set and hacked into pieces. The goddess Isis reassembled the pieces and Osiris was magically restored, and went on to become the god of the afterlife. In fact, you may not know this, but Egyptian mythology is pretty, thick in terms of the happenings and the backstories behind the different gods and goddesses. However, just like most pantheons, each god and goddess carries a purpose, and in this way, this purpose directly applies to the way, like the actual way, that mummification and embalming went down. The stoppers of the canopic jars at the top were shaped like the heads of the 4 sons of the god Horus, and each son protected the organ placed inside of his or her respective jar. Tuaneth had the head of the jackal and guarded the jar that contained the stomach. As you can see here, here's a brief general depiction of what these canopic jars might have looked like. Klebenisov, who had the head of the falcon, watched over the intestines. Hapi, the baboon-headed son of Horus, protected the lungs. And while human-headed Imseti was in charge of protecting the liver, all these gods essentially looked out over the life being of the organs. Now, these canopic jars would later be found by many different types of people who went into the tombs and into the pyramids themselves, but keep in mind that the organs were not in fact foolproof to decay and rot over time. In fact, canopic jars were usually stored in a chest that was later placed in the tomb with the mummy itself. These chests might have looked like this. After 40 days, the body was completely dried. The skin became shrunken, wrinkled, and leathery. The bundles of natron were removed from the body cavity. The mummy was cleaned one more time and, of course, rubbed with natron all over the skin. And this helped preserve the way that the mummy was essentially identified. The mummy's head and body were packed with herbs, sawdust, and linen soaked in scented oil, so that they could regain the shape that they had in life. Stones or small onions were often placed under the eyelids to restore a lifelike appearance. Once this was done, the mummy could be covered with necklaces, rings, and bracelets made of gold and gems. In one Egyptian myth, the god Horus had his eyes miraculously restored after losing it in a battle with the evil god Set, and the eye of Horus, called a wedjat, is associated with healing and protection. A wax or bronze plate with the wedjat carved on it was placed over the embalming incision to magically heal the gash in the afterlife. Once again, this strong belief in pantheon and mythology helped guide the Egyptians to do exactly what they wanted to do with dead bodies. The entire body was then covered in shrouds and bound with strips of linen until the mummy has returned to its original size. And this was a complicated job. It could take as long as a week. And in fact, all the wrapping and the precision to, of course, get this just right was really important for the people, of course, partaking in this process. Small magical amulets were inserted between the layers of the bandages to further protect the mummy's spirit on its way to the afterlife. As each layer was added, it was coated with resin to hold the wrappings together with a waterproof seal. Section 3, the final phases, the burial and beyond. After the wrapping was finished, the head of the mummy was covered with a portrait mask just to make sure that the spirit would recognize itself. Additionally, the masked mummy was then placed in a series of gilded wooden coffins and put into a sarcophagus. You might have seen, of course, sarcophagus like this before, and in this way, they were essentially really well preserving the body. Sometimes you might find coffins, inside more coffins. On the day of the funeral, the mummy was brought to the tomb where priests performed the opening of the mouth ritual, touching the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the coffin with a sacred tool. This ritual reactivated these senses for the afterlife that they would definitely need. Before the tomb was sealed, family members deposited food, clothing, furniture, dishes, which Egyptians believed the deceased would need for the eternity. Scenes of offering bearers and daily life were printed on the walls of the tomb, which provided comforting and familiar sounds or surroundings for the deceased in the afterlife. You might have seen pictures like this before. After the tombs were closed, some wealthy families hired priests to offer food for the soul of the deceased periodically. Family members visited the site during special holidays to conduct ceremonies for the deceased. And that is basically how the process of Egyptian mummification works. That is the end. Or is it? The one thing about Egyptian mythology that's quite compelling is that it gives us not only an understanding of what Egyptians valued in terms of their methodology for everyday life, but how they prepared for the world beyond. Think about how this process relates to what morticians do today in terms of the actual process of preserving a deceased body, and what we do as people who practice different faiths and what we believe in the afterlife as we know it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with the rest of the lesson.